Okay, well, we're wrapping this up. We have this last part and then some final thoughts that I want to put together. But this is on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I had a few things that I want to show you about the Dead Sea Scrolls because they've been a very popular thing. People have talked about them. Very influential, obviously. A lot of people hold these scrolls up as absolute proof of the Bible, of Hebrew, of, basically the Jews being God's chosen people and so on and so forth. But as is the case with everything else, we need to walk the narrow road, and there's more to the story. So let's read a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here they are on Wikipedia, and they're very famous, of course. The Dead Sea Scrolls, also the Qumran Cave Scrolls, are a set of ancient Jewish manuscripts from the Second Temple period. They were discovered over a period of 10 years between 1946, remember this date, and 1956 at the Qumran Caves near the Ain Fekshah in the West Bank on the northern shore of the Dead Sea. Dating from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD, the Dead Sea Scrolls include the oldest surviving manuscripts of entire books, later included in the biblical canons, along with extra-biblical and deuterocanonical manuscripts from the Second Temple Judaism. At the same time, they cast new light on the emergence of Christianity and of rabbinic Judaism. Almost all of the 15,000 scrolls and scroll fragments are held in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum, located in the city of Jerusalem. The Israeli government's custody of the Dead Sea Scrolls is disputed by Jordan and the Palestinian Authority on territorial, legal, and humanitarian grounds. They were mostly discovered following the Jordanian annexation of the West Bank and were acquired by Israel after Jordan lost the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. Whilst Israel's claims are primarily based on historical and religious grounds, given their significance in Jewish history and the heritage of Judaism. So they're very important for the state of Israel. Keep that in mind. It's a very important detail. Most of the manuscripts are written in Hebrew, with some written in Aramaic. Now, when it says Hebrew, we have to raise a Fennec fox here and say, what do you mean by Hebrew? Because there's Paleo-Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, Masoretic Hebrew. What are we talking about? At what point are we talking about with Hebrew? And this is the point of today. Yada yada, and a few Greek discoveries from the Judean desert, and add Latin from Masada and Arabic. So it's got Latin, Greek, Arabic, Aramaic, and quote-unquote Hebrew. Most of the texts are written on parchment, very important, some on papyrus, and one on copper. Through scholarly consensus, dates the Dead Sea Scrolls to between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD, which you will learn I'm very skeptical of. There are manuscripts from associated Judean desert sites that are dated to as early as the 8th century BC and as late as the 11th century AD. So a large range of dates in the particular place that they found. Bronze coins found at the same sites from a series beginning with John Hyrcanus, a ruler of the Hasmonean kingdom, and continuing into the period of the First Jewish-Roman War, which was 70 AD approximately, supporting the paleography and radiocarbon dating of the scrolls. So, this is where they were found, in these caves. Obviously, you probably know that by now, but very interesting that the Dead Sea Scrolls were a very big find. And also, the time that they were found, which is very interesting. We'll be talking about that a little bit as well. But most of the time, the sections in the Dead Sea Scrolls agree with the Septuagint, so, that's a good thing. Although people still don't use the Septuagint, thanks to the KJV only movement who's demonized it. But it's been useful to prove the Septuagint either way. So that's very important. However, there are some things that we need to be aware of, which is the following. If I can open this up. This is from pbs.org, and it is the mystery and the meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Very important. There's a lot to read here, but it says, beginning in 1953, an international team of young scholars were assembled in Jerusalem under Jordanian auspices to sort out these thousands of fragments. Most of the 7-man team, which included no Jews, were Catholic priests. Uh-oh. That's interesting. In retrospect, their accomplishments were remarkable. While the task of identifying fragments will never be completed, even today new pieces are being fit into puzzles, which we'll have to watch and see if this develops into anything, but either way, we'll talk about this a little bit later. By 1960, this team of scholars had not only identified the pieces of the 800 documents and arranged them as well as they could, They had also deciphered and transcribed them so that they could be easily read. Very interesting situation, but most of the team was the Catholic priests. So the Vatican was very quick to have its grubby little paws on there, and that's something to be aware of. They're also mostly written on vermilion sheepskin. Why is that significant? Well, let's learn about sheepskin. This is from archaeology.org. According to a Science News report, a molecular biologist, Oded Rekavi of Tel Aviv University, and his colleagues analyzed animal DNA obtained from 26 Dead Sea Scroll fragments in order to study the possible origins of the ancient parchments. After they excluded the DNA left behind by people who handled the scrolls, the researchers determined that 2 of the fragments were made from cow skin, and the rest were made from sheepskin. Further analysis of mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA indicates that 8 of the fragments came from closely related sheep, which suggests these documents were all produced in the same place. Okay, interesting. Nothing really super controversial about that, but definitely something to slot in the back of your mind. This is an article from SciTech Daily. Medieval lawyers wrote on sheepskin parchment because it helped prevent fraud. Here's a parchment, which is very interesting. Lawyers used sheepskin as anti-fraud device for hundreds of years to stop fraudsters pulling the wool over people's eyes, study shows. Medieval and early modern lawyers chose to write on sheepskin parchment because it helped prevent fraud, a new analysis suggests. Experts have identified the species of animals used for British legal documents dating from the 13th to the 20th century, and have discovered they were almost always written on sheepskin rather than goatskin or calfskin. This may have been because the structure of sheepskin made attempts to remove or modify text obvious. So sheepskin has some very interesting properties to it because of the fat in the skin, apparently. But anyway, there's that. So sheepskin was very much used in the Middle Ages to do certain things and to prevent fraud and so on, to make things look authentic. Keep that in mind. This is Wikipedia. We're reading about parchment. Parchment is a writing material made from specially prepared untanned skins of animals, primarily sheep, calves, and goats. It has been used as a writing medium for over 2 millennia. Vellum is a finer quality parchment made from the skin of young animals, such as lambs and young calves. It's sometimes called animal membrane by libraries and museums that wish to avoid distinguishing between parchment and more restricted term vellum. So this is how it's made. Very interesting thing. It's been used for quite a while. Now we're going to read about history of parchment. By the 4th century AD, in cultures that traditionally used papyrus for writing, parchment began to become the new standard for use in the manufacturing important books. So parchment was used, but by the 4th century, it was the dominant way of doing things, which already puts us outside of the dates arrived at for the Dead Sea Scrolls, if we're talking about the parchment being from the time that it was commonly used. And most works which wished to be preserved were eventually moved from papyrus to parchment. In the later Middle Ages, especially the 15th century, parchment was largely replaced by paper for most uses except luxury manuscripts, some of which were also on paper. New techniques in paper milling allowed it to be much cheaper than parchment. It was made of textile rags and very high quality. Following the arrival of printing in the later 15th century, the supply of animal skins for parchment could not keep up with the demand for printers. So by the 15th century, 1500s, parchment went out of style. So from about 300 AD to about 1400 AD, give or take, parchment was king. That's very important. It's very important to understand that time range. A couple things here, a couple pictures you can see, these various things that people would use. So very interesting little bit of history. So what does this all tell us? Well, it's not absolute proof that the Dead Sea Scrolls are not as old as they're telling us, meaning they're younger in that case. It's not absolute proof because some of the documents were papyrus, and parchment and papyrus were running side by side for a while. However, parchment did win over papyrus by the 4th century, around the 300s, and it was until the 14th century or the 1300s or so when paper started to come into play. So parchment had a pretty long time that it was being used, especially sheepskin, which is very important, because some have commented that this is a significant detail. if parchments were created during a popular time, meaning if the parchments of the Dead Sea Scrolls that they discovered were actually created during when parchment was being used, then they're much younger than what they're attesting to. So this is a very important thing. Right off the bat, that's an interesting detail. Again, it's not absolute proof, but it's just one thing I want you to pin. So we have 2 pins now. We have the Vatican was immediately all over it. It was discovered, actually probably 3 pins, I guess, if you want to include the discovery time. It was discovered right around the state of Israel being created, which legitimizes certain things. The Vatican was all over it, and it was written mostly on vermilion sheepskin, which that's interesting. That's an interesting detail. So far, there's some interesting details. Just pin them on a board and see what happens. Now, another thing is that the script of these things is in Mishnaic Hebrew. This is the Damascus document. Ancient Hebrew text known from both the Cairo Geniza and the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is considered one of the foundational documents of the ancient Jewish community of Qumran, the Damascus document. So if you look at this picture, does that look like, what does that look like? Well, it looks like Mishnaic Hebrew. It looks like Hebrew that was in circulation, after the temple was destroyed, which is very interesting. Again, just adding these things to the list. If you go to Google and you type in how old is the Damascus document, you get some interesting things. It says Damascus document is a collection of rules and instructions that was copied from earlier Hebrew source in the 10th century. The document was discovered in 1897 by Solomon Schechter, a storeroom in Old Cairo, and he dated the fragments to the 10th and 11th, 12th centuries. So the document they found is a copy of an older document, but they're saying it's a 10th century document that was copied from an earlier Hebrew source. So they don't have the actual Hebrew source, but they're saying, okay, this is part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's super old. So it's a little confusing, to be honest with you. But the Damascus document is the 10th century, and it has that Hebrew writing on it that you saw. It's very square script. So it proves to you that it's not that old, what they're looking at. This is the Temple Scroll. It's got the same kind of writing. Look, same kind of writing. So if it's got the same kind of writing, look, you can see the little crowns on there. You can see the esoteric alphabet already shaping up. And the question is, if it's got the same kind of writing in the Damascus scroll is from the 10th century, and they're saying that this is from, what does it say? Well, we'll read about it in a second, but they said it's much younger. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. Now, this temple scroll was one of the discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It describes a Jewish temple. Ding, ding, ding. Along with extensive detailed regulations about sacrifices and temple practices. The document is written in the form of a revelation from God to Moses, a revelation that is outside of the revelation of the Bible, thereby with the intended meaning that this is the more appropriate temple which was revealed to Moses, and that Moses' instructions were either forgotten or ignored when Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem. So there you go. I guess we have to build a third temple and make it right. Do you see where this is going? In other words, in the mind of the scroll writer, Solomon should have actually built the first temple as it is described in the temple scroll, which of course is just rabbinic Judaism. Kabbalah, false Christ, false rabbinic age, golden age, third temple, this narrative that they've been on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Because again, if you look at the text, how it's written, it's not Paleo-Hebrew, I can tell you that. And it's not like Aramaic. I mean, it's definitely, you can see the characters are very new compared to modern Hebrew, quote-unquote Hebrew. And if you type in how old is the temple scroll in Google, let's see a different color for these highlights because you can't see it. There we go. The temple scroll is a Dead Sea Scroll that is dated to the 1st century BC and 1st century CE. Okay, between like 90 BC and before the first like 100 AD, in that period of time, with that kind of writing, that's strange. The scroll is written on parchment and is 24 to 26 inches high and 840 centimeters long. So it's written on parchment, which again, parchment really became the dominant in the 4th century. And it's got writing that is very akin to modern Hebrew, which is Mishnaic or Masoretic Hebrew. So this is very interesting. Another one says, most scholars believe that all 3 manuscripts are copies of an original work composed in the land of Israel in the second half of the 2nd century, after 120 BC, perhaps during rule of John Hyrcanus. So they say, okay, well, maybe it's a copy. I don't know. It's very confusing, to be honest with you. There's a lot of confusion with this whole Dead Sea stuff. Either way, something doesn't check out. If we click to examine the scroll, see, look at this. You can examine it. We can just drag this, I think. Yeah, we can drag it. See, you can examine this for yourself. This is dss.collections.imj.org.il/temple. You can examine the temple scroll for yourself. Look, does that look like writing that was, in the 1st century BC? I don't think so, folks. And the fact that it has to deal with a perfect temple, and it was supposedly discovered, right when the state of Israel was formed, and that was basically propelling Zionism and Christian Zionism and dispensationalism and the Great Delusion forward. It just seems too well-timed to me, ultimately. It just seems too well-timed, just too convenient. Let's look at another one. This is another thing. Okay. Well, we have one more point to look at. But so what's the point with the ones we just looked at? Well, these scripts are not from 200 BC. They're not. They're not from 100 BC. In 100 AD, the Nabatean and Aramaic scripts were what influenced the Hebrew Mishnaic script. So the Mishnaic alphabet developed after 100 AD. And of course, these are written on parchment also, which again suggests a later date. Now, parchment doesn't exclusively mean in the 4th century or beyond that, because parchment was used, but you just add one and one together with the alphabet and the parchment and the timing of everything. I'm just very suspect of it. I'm not presenting absolute proof. I'm out with that right now from the very beginning, but I'm very suspect of it. And of course, again, the scroll was found with a mention of the temple that should have been built. So we will have to watch this and see if they use any of these Dead Sea Scrolls as part of the Great Delusion narrative when the Third Temple starts getting back in the news cycles. Right now, with all this Israel stuff, at the time of this video, they're still fighting and conflicting with one another. I'm sure that there will have to be a peace deal, or maybe they're going to go with the Third Temple and make the Middle East explode in conflict, and that will be what brings the peace deal. But either way, they will build the Third Temple, folks. So it'll be interesting to see, now that you understand how the Dead Sea Scrolls falls into this, if there's going to be a relationship there. Like if, for example, they pull this temple scroll up and say, see, this was the revelation given to God, or given to Moses by God, that we need to build this temple, and this is going to be the temple. That would be interesting. That would for sure be another piece of evidence to say that this was definitely choreographed. There's also the issue with Dr. Strugnell, and let's read about him a little bit. Dr. Strugnell was a famous figure on this particular topic. And he was, he was born May 1930. He died in 2007. He was English professor emeritus at Harvard Divinity School and a former editor-in-chief of the Dead Sea Scrolls Project. Strugnell became, at 23, the youngest member of the team of scholars led by Roland de Vaux, formed in 1954 to edit the Dead Sea Scrolls in Jerusalem. He was studying Oriental languages at Jesus College, and at Sir Godfrey Rolls Driver, a lecturer in Semitic philology, nominated him to join the Scrolls editorial team. Although Strugnell had no previous experience in paleography, he learned very quickly how to read the scrolls. He would be involved in the Dead Sea Scrolls project for more than 40 years. Very significant person in this project. Now, if we go down to the Haaretz interview controversy, in 1990, Strugnell gave an interview to Haaretz in which he said that Judaism was a horrible religion which should not exist. He also said that Judaism was a Christian heresy, and we deal with our heretics in different ways. You are a phenomenon that we haven't managed to convert, and we should have managed. There was immediate condemnation of his comments, including an editorial in the New York Times as a result of the interview. Strugnell was forced to take early retirement on medical grounds at Harvard, and he was removed from his editorial post on the Scrolls Project by the Israel Antiquities Authority, which cited his deteriorating health as a reason for his removal. Strugnell later said that he was suffering from stress-induced alcoholism and manic depression when he gave the interview. He insisted that his remarks were taken out of context and that he meant horrible only in the Miltonian sense of deplored in antiquity. In a 2007 interview in Biblical Archaeology Review, Frank Moore Cross said that despite Strugnell's comments, which were based on a theological argument of the early church fathers that Christianity superseded Judaism. Remember what the church fathers felt about the Jews. Strugnell had very friendly relationships with a number of Jewish scholars, some of whom signed a letter of support for him, which was published in the Chicago Tribune in 1991. Aftermath. Strugnell had come increasingly under controversy for his slow progress in publishing the scrolls and his refusal to give scholars free access to the unpublished scrolls. Yeah, they took a long time to actually publish these scrolls, which is also another fishy thing. Some argue the removal of Strugnell from his editorial post ended the more than 3-decade blockade that he and other Harvard-educated scholars, such as Notre Dame's Eugene Ulrich, had maintained to keep the other scholars from accessing the scrolls. The blockade on the publication of the scrolls effected by Strugnell and other members of Harvard's academic community was broken by the combined efforts of Herschel Shanks of the Biblical Archaeology Review, who had personally waged a 15-year campaign to release the scrolls, and Ben Zion, watchholder of Hebrew Union College, along with his student Martin Abegg, who published the first facsimile of the suppressed scrolls in 1991. Strugnell insisted that he tried to publish the scrolls as quickly as he could, but that his team was the limiting factor. Shortly after Strugnell was dismissed from his post, he was institutionalized in McLean Hospital for a period. At the time of his death, he was professor emeritus at Harvard Divinity School. So, very interesting situation. I'm sure there's probably more to the story. But why is it interesting? Well, Dr. Strugnell was a leading person on this project for 40 years. He was the only one that wasn't a Catholic or Orthodox Jew involved with any of this. Yet he was removed because of this controversy and spiraled into alcoholism and he died discredited. And of course, there were people who supported him, but very interesting that there was a blockade. They didn't want to release it. He had some things to say against the Jews. Then they created this controversy. They kicked him out of the project, and he was the only one that wasn't a Catholic or an Orthodox Jew. Very, very interesting. And again, combined with all the other things and how long it took him to publish the findings, which is decades, and of course the exclusivity of the Vatican over the whole thing, it's just very fishy, folks. It's very fishy. Now, there's one more pin in our board that we want to draw then before we draw the lines between. And of course, that's the Copper Scroll. And we're going to read about the Copper Scroll here. The Copper Scroll is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls found in the cave, yada yada, but differs significantly from the others. Whereas the other scrolls are written on parchment or papyrus, this scroll is written on metal. Copper mixed with about 1% tin. Although no metallic copper remained in the strips, the action of the centuries had been to convert the metal into brittle oxide. Now, if you know how copper oxidizes, it turns blue. This doesn't look oxidized to me, which again is just very strange. The so-called scrolls of copper were in reality two separate sections of what was originally a single scroll about 2.4 meters in length. Unlike the others, it is not a literary work, but a list of 64 places where various items of gold and silver are buried or hidden. Keep that in mind. It differs from the other scrolls in its Hebrew, quote-unquote Hebrew, closer to the language of the Mishnah than to the literary Hebrew of the other scrolls, though it shares some language characteristics. Its orthography, paleography, and date, possibly overlapping to the other Qumran scripts, yada yada. So, history. While most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were found by the Bedouins, the Copper Scroll was discovered by an archaeologist. The scroll on the 2 rolls of copper was found in March 1952 at the back of the Cave 3 at Qumran. It was the last of the 15 scrolls discovered in the cave and is thus referred to as 3Q15. The corroded metal could not be unrolled by unconventional means, and so the Jordanian government sent it to Manchester University's College of Technology in England on the recommendation of English archaeologist of the Dead Sea Scrolls John Allegro, for it to be cut into sections, allowing the text to be read. He arranged for the university's professor Baker to cut the siege into 23 strips in 1955 and 1956. It then became clear that the scrolls were part of the same document. Allegro, who also supervised the opening of the scroll, transcribed its contents immediately. Very interesting situation here. Dating. Scholarly estimates of the probable date range of the Copper Scroll vary. Frank Cross proposes the period from 25 to 75 AD on paleographical grounds, while William Albright suggests 70 to 135 AD. Manfred Lehmann put forward a similar age date ranged to Albright, arguing that the treasure was principally the money accumulated between the First Jewish-Roman War and the Bar Kokhba revolt, while the temple lay in ruins. Kyle McCharter, Albert Wolters, David Wilma, and Judah Lefkowitz all agree that the scroll originated around 70 AD. Contrarily, Emil Puek argues that the copper scroll could not have been deposited behind 40 jars after they were already in place, so the scroll predates 68 AD. Joseph Milik proposed that the scroll was written around 100 AD. If this dating is correct, it would mean that the scroll did not come from the Qumran community, because the settlement had been destroyed by the Romans decades earlier. That's also an interesting point. Maybe it's not from Qumran. Language and writing style. The style of writing is unusual, different from the other scrolls. It is written in a style similar to Mishnaic Hebrew. When was Mishnaic Hebrew on? Let's look at it really quick. Here we go. You can see. What does that look like? Doesn't look like Paleo Hebrew or anything older. It looks a little bit newer to me. But who am I to say anything? While Hebrew is a well-known language, the majority of ancient Hebrew texts in which the language is studied is generally biblical in nature, which the Copper Scroll is not. As a result, most of the vocabulary is simply not found in the Bible or anything else we have from ancient times. The orthography is unusual, the script having the features resulting from being written on copper with hammer and chisel. There's also the anomaly of the 7 of the location names are followed by a group of 2 or 3 Greek letters, thought by some to represent numerical values. Possibly gematria, maybe? Also, the clauses within the scroll mark intriguing parallels to that of Greek inventories. From the Greek Temple of Apollo. This similarity to the Greek inventories would suggest that the scroll is in fact an authentic temple inventory. Very different scroll. Some scholars believe that the difficulty in deciphering the text is perhaps due to it having been copied from another original document by an illiterate scribe who did not speak the language in which the scroll was written, or at least was not familiar. As Milik puts it, the scribe, quote, uses the forms and ligature of the cursive script along with formal letters, and often confuses graphically several letters of the formal hand. As a result, it has made translation and understanding the text difficult. So, supposedly, they think it might even be an illiterate scribe who was maybe rushing to do this for some reason. So there's very interesting things with this copper scroll. Something is very strange. It's not adding up. Just a strange piece of the puzzle, because it's strange as they cut this into multiple pieces, banged out the fragments together, and soldered it back as if it, if it was just some thing that was made yesterday. This is an ancient artifact, and you're ripping it to shreds and soldering and hammering it. This doesn't seem right. Also, the script is not from the 1st century. It's newer. Even they admit that. Even though they're trying to date it, even the oldest date was like 100 AD, which doesn't make sense given the script that's written. It's also strange that it's not fully corroded, even though that area is covered in like humidity and salty air. 2,000 years? Copper would have been completely oxidized and blue. But it's not. So something is not adding up here, folks. It's not adding up. The conclusion is that there are several reasons to be skeptical of these Dead Sea Scrolls being from 300 BC or whatever to 100 AD. There's some skepticism, I think, that's healthy there. It's difficult to know exactly what happened, but some people have suggested a Templar conspiracy. So what is the Templar conspiracy? Well, I am not saying that this is absolute fact, but it does seem to fit the narrative of everything else very nicely, to some degree. It would not surprise me if it were true to some extent, but I'm just presenting it to you because I think it's interesting. Some have brought up the possibility that the Templars were involved through the Crusades. Of course, during the Crusades, the Templars took over Jerusalem around 1000 AD, and this is also around the time that the Masoretes composed the Leningrad Codex. But anyway, the Templars got involved with the Kabbalah and all this esoteric knowledge and discovering ancient texts and basically, practicing very occult activities. We know because when the Templars were disbanded, they were disbanded because of reports of satanic rituals, orgies, all kinds of occult activity, and just evil behavior. So the Templars are also the source of secret societies. This is how the Freemasons began. Others, like the Jesuits, the Illuminati, all these things come from the mystery religion. And of course, if you understand Revelation 13:2, the dragon gave the beast its great authority and power and its throne. What does that mean? Well, that means that Satan in the church age chose a particular vehicle to actualize all of the mystery cults in religion. And that is the Catholic Church through the papacy, the God King, the Pope, as the top of that system. And as a result, Satan had to weave all the threads that he had created back into a particular vehicle. So that's why you start to see over time all of these threads weaving into one. It's very clever. You see Kabbalah, you see the Crusaders, then you see that influencing secret societies. Everything is just weaving into one reality, and of course that reality is going to be the counterfeit Christian reality. It's the Catholic reality. But either way, the Templars probably needed evidence to legitimize their claim over the Holy Land to the Pope and say, look, we found evidence. We have to be here. So they probably took some Jewish Pharisee and made them write these documents. That way there would be proof of the discoveries and proof that God wanted the Catholic Church to be there. Of course, the surrounding area was Muslim, and there's no access to papyrus at the time, and it was certainly not being used at all, really, because you had parchment. So they had sheepskin, and they used sheepskin. We also know, this is very well documented, that Rome is very well known for its multiple forgeries. So many forgeries have come out of Rome, like the donation of Constantine, if you know about that the popes used for 400 years to appeal to their authority, which, by the way, is an argument against them because they used the donation of Constantine, which was a forgery, but they used it for hundreds of years to appeal to their godly authority. And the donation of Constantine calls the Pope the Vicarius Filii Dei, Vicar of Christ on earth. So anyway, that's a forgery. The Shroud of Turin, if you know about that, countless art forgeries in the Renaissance and all these things, the books forgeries. There's so many forgeries that came out of Rome. It's the capital of forgeries. And so that's something that's very suspect that we know. We also know the Qumran area was very well traveled, which is very strange that nobody discovered these in 2,000 years. Nobody discovered them. So they probably had somebody guarding it in some more form or fashion. 1946 was the first discovery. And of course, 2 years later, 1948, the state of Israel was created. Suddenly now, this discovery was revealed by a shepherd boy, and there's this biblical significance to the land of Israel. It's just too convenient, folks. It's too convenient. It's too well-timed. So what were the motives? Well, there's definitely motive too as well, to make money off scholars, magazines, basically movie rights, documentaries. The Dead Sea Scrolls have been a huge success from a business perspective. Of course, they waited several decades to release them and to build anticipation, and now they've milked them quite a bit. Also, possibly to legitimize the state of Israel as the Holy Land, beef up dispensationalism, the whole Third Temple narrative and things like that. It's not 100% obvious, and like I said, I'm not saying that this is the absolute truth. I'm really not. I'm just saying it's interesting, and it fits the narrative, and it's possible. There's not enough evidence, I think, yet to make a conclusive decision. However, there's enough evidence, I believe, from the things I presented you with the Dead Sea Scrolls to be skeptical. I mean, again, the Vatican got its paws all over it. That tells you right away that you should be skeptical of what you hear about these things. If there was a conspiracy in the 11th century with the Templars, I don't think that there would be a connection to it today. Meaning they probably could, if the Templars did do something, and they created these things, they did it to legitimize their claim over the Holy Land. Then it got forgotten about. And if anything, they are the current powers, the Vatican, cashed in on that treasure trove to basically legitimize the state of Israel and further their agenda with the whole Third Temple narrative and futurist narrative. That would be what I could see happening. I don't see the conspiracy starting with the Templars and they're planning, like 1,000 years ahead, they're going to release this and fool the world. I don't think that would be the case. I think very likely if there was an issue with the Templars, they would have done something to legitimize their hold over the Holy Land. And, it got forgotten about. And then, of course, the Vatican knows about it. So they decided to cash that one in with the whole State of Israel thing. And so now people are all about the State of Israel. So either way, what will be interesting to see is if they do anything with this Dead Sea Scrolls or the Temple Scroll or anything like that in the future. That will be the interesting thing, because if they do, then you know that this is choreographed. Absolutely. So ultimately, to me, all the evidence I've shown you It's definitely, I'm skeptical. It's something to be skeptical of. I don't have an absolute answer for you as to what they are. But the important point is this, folks. Everything that you learn, take with a grain of salt and learn to be a Berean. Learn to test everything with scripture, with history, with science. Test. Be a tester. Do not take somebody's word for it. Test. That's why I make these videos so long and in depth, because I want you to see the evidence rather than taking my words for it. And if I do comment on something, I'm commenting on something that I've backed up with plenty of evidence, and hopefully you see that. So on to, now that we've finished all of these things, now on to the epilogue. Let's get some final thoughts in this and wrap it up.